Welcome. I'm Erik Fleming, host of A Moment with Erik Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Erik Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenterik.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well.
The following program is hosted by the NVG Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Erik Fleming. I am your host, Erik Fleming. And so today I have 2 Harvard professors. Yeah, we got 2 Harvard professors on the podcast. Alexandra Natapoff, who is a professor at the law school, and she has co-authored a book called America Unfinished. And then Dr. Bianca Baldridge, who is a Harvard education professor. She's at the graduate school of education. And she has written a book called Laboring in the Shadows. But her Labor in the Shadows is about Black youth workers, people who help Black children, like in after school, preschool, those folks. She's been a crusader for youth workers in and out of the classroom. So that's what our discussion is going to be about. So it is cool that we've gotten to the point now where we're getting Harvard professors. They're not the first ones, but, it's a sign of where we've come as a show, that we are getting people like that to come on. Every week I try to have the best possible guests, as far as expertise and as far as stature. Every now and then you'll get somebody that you may have read about in the newspaper or saw on the internet or saw on TV. But, I'm trying to get the best. And I always say that my guests are more intelligent than I am. And that's not self-deprecation. That's just facts. I'm not the smartest guy on the planet, nor have I ever claimed to be. At one time, I thought I was the baddest dude on the planet. And then I got reminded that I wasn't. But I just want you all as listeners to, instead of dealing with the hype and the little 15-second sound bites and all that stuff, I want you to get the meat of it. We might crack a joke or two, but I'm not going to win you over with buffoonery. Although I think humor is very, very important in this time. My style is I ask questions. I get people that can give you answers. And I hope that you are receiving this well. And if you are, then please go to www.momenteric.com and show your support either by giving this podcast 5 stars, making a one-time donation, or subscribing. Write a review. Whatever you want to do, please go to the website, check it out, and just let the people that are the other people that are supporting the podcast that you are listening to. How about that? I just thank y'all for listening as always, but yeah, it'd be nice to see a little more support, only because we're within the 90-day window now with the elections. We got to keep things going. We got to be encouraged, right? So anyway, enough of that. Let's get on with the show. And as always, we kick it off with a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Erik. 3 suspects have been arrested in separate incidents for sending death threats to witnesses following the disappearance and death of Nolan Wells in Mississippi. U.S. Senator Mitch McConnell was released from a Kentucky rehabilitation facility to finish his recovery at home. Abdul El-Sayed won the Democratic Party nomination in the Michigan U.S. Senate primary, and he will face Republican former Congressman Mike Rogers in November. State Representative Justin Pearson won the Tennessee 9th Congressional District's Democratic primary. Donovan McKinney, a state representative, ousted U.S. Congressman Shri Tanadar in Michigan's 13th Congressional District Democratic primary. The Department of Justice dropped vandalism charges against former Olympian Davey Hearn after concluding that a flawed installation caused the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool liner to peel. Congressman Wesley Bell successfully defended his U.S. House Senate seat against a Democratic primary challenge from former Congresswoman Cori Bush in Missouri's 1st Congressional District. The U.S. Senate confirmed Dr. Erica Schwartz as the CDC director, making her the first African-American woman to hold the post. Reverend Adam Hamilton won Kansas's Democratic Senate primary, setting him up to face off in November against incumbent Senator Roger Marshall. Senator Rand Paul referred Dr. Anthony Fauci to the Department of Justice after a Senate committee voted along party lines to hold Fauci in contempt of Congress. A Spokane resident was arrested on arson charges for allegedly starting one of 3 Washington fires that forced mass evacuations and destroyed hundreds of buildings. A federal judge granted the Justice Department's request to dismiss convictions against members of the Oath Keepers involved in the January 6th Capitol attack. And the largest cyclosporiasis outbreak in U.S. history has claimed its first 2 fatalities in Michigan. I am Grace G, and this has been a Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. Now it is time for my guest, Alexandra Natapoff. Alexandra Natapoff is an award-winning criminal justice scholar and a Lee S. Krendler Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. She writes about criminal courts, public defense, plea bargaining, wrongful convictions, and race and inequality in the criminal system. She previously served as a federal public defender in Baltimore, Maryland. She is also the co-author of this book called America Unfinished. And so we'll be talking a little bit about her work as a public defender and how that has shaped her career. And we're going to be talking about America Unfinished. So ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest of this podcast, Alexandra Natapoff. All right. Alexandra Natapoff. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Well, I'm really, really honored to have you on And I won't say it's a series, but you wrote this, you and Guy Charles wrote this incredible book. Well, let's not say you compiled like these essays, right?
Yeah.
And we give you authors credit because you were the one that came up with the idea, but you compiled these essays into this book called America Unfinished. And so you and some other people will be on the show to talk about their parts in the book and all that. But I'm really, really glad to have you because you were the, I don't know, conspirator, the visionary. I don't know what term you want to use, but to come up with this concept to do this.
I like conspirator. Can I have that one?
Yes, ma'am. You sure can. So we're going to get into that a little bit, but I want to do my normal icebreaker, which is to throw a quote at you first. And I want you to respond to the quote. And the quote is, "The world will little note, no long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced."
Well, thank you for that particular quote. It's actually the quote from which we stole the book title. The book is called America Unfinished because we thought it captured precisely that spirit, which is that our democracy, that our legal system, they're not finished. We don't inherit them complete from the previous generation, and we don't hand them down complete to the next generation. We are always working on them. And the quote, of course, is from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and he gave it in the middle of the Civil War to honor the unfinished work of building, as he put it, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And of course, that was one of the most fraught, important, violent moments in our 250-year history of working out what do we mean by the people? Who is going to be included in that idea, in that ideal? So we took the term unfinished from Lincoln, from the Gettysburg Address, because we wanted to honor that spirit. Now, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, it's a time to think about not only this moment in history that we are currently facing, a very fraught, a very contested, a moment of great change, but also to look back over our history and see the arc of all the things we have built. And this book is about the legal infrastructure of that experiment, of that journey.
Okay. So now the next icebreaker is what we call 20 questions. So I need you to give me a number between 1 and 20.
Okay. Oh, just 14.
Okay. What does the idea of a better world mean to you? And what would be different in that better world?
Do you mind my asking why that's 14?
Just random.
Oh, okay.
Just random.
I like to know what kind of questions I'm answering. So I'm going to answer from the perspective of my legal and scholarly expertise and the subject that I wrote about for the book. So Professor Charles, as you noted, he and I conceived of and pulled together and edited this book, 62 essays by 62 different Harvard law professors. That's what the book is. But we each also contributed an essay, and I contributed an essay about our criminal system because that is the space in which I have been working for 20 years. And the essay that I wrote. Before I became a law professor, I was a federal public defender in Baltimore. And so I sometimes joke, but it's not really a joke, that everything interesting that I know and learned, I learned in Baltimore. About our criminal system, but also about our democracy, about the inequality in our democracy, about the racism in our democracy. And to me, all those things have dramatically come to a head and can be seen in our criminal system. And so that's why I've focused on the criminal system, not because it's the only space in which to focus, but because it's so representative and so destructive and so dehumanizing and so inegalitarian. And so for me, a better world is where our laws, our democracy, our citizenship, our ability to be part of this community could meaningfully be deployed to make our criminal system in particular and our democracy more generally a more inclusive, egalitarian, humane space that we could be more proud of. And being a public defender is in many ways a depressing endeavor. You're really in the belly of the beast. People's lives are being crushed. Their families are being crushed. The neighborhoods in Baltimore are being crushed by the criminal system. And yet at the same time, it is a space in which people and legislators and lawyers and activists and community members can deploy the tools of democracy, of legislation, of law, to meaningfully push back. And so at the same time as I saw great injustice and great sadness in my clients' lives and in their cases, I also saw the possibilities of pushing back through law. And it was the inspiration for becoming a law professor. And so I write in the book about how our criminal system actually works pretty well for the wealthy, for the well-resourced, for people who are valued by the criminal system. It's not true for most Americans. Most ordinary Americans are not valued by our criminal system. But a better world would be one in which our legal infrastructure, our criminal system, accorded everyone the same dignity, respect, importance, and therefore protections of rule of law and the principles of rule of law. We're a long way off from that better world, I think. But to me, that's always a fight worth having.
Yeah, and I'm going to get back to that particular contribution you made about the rule of law, because I really want you to dive into that a little bit. But before I get into that, I wanted to ask this question. Oh, I know what I wanted to say before. So my uncle was an attorney in Baltimore. I don't know if you knew him or not. His name was Fred Charleston, but he was an attorney in Baltimore for a number of years before he passed away. Why is Harvard important as an American institution?
That's a great question. It's important for all kinds of reasons, both wonderful and problematic. So let's start with the problematic. It's an institution of great wealth, power, influence. It has been part of and produced the knowledge and the personnel for many of the inequalities that we were just talking about. It has not in its history always been an egalitarian or redistributive institution. At the same time, it's an institution of extraordinary knowledge and influence. It has brought so many people into the ability to speak about, of course, I teach at the law school, so I'm partial to law, but Harvard, as one of the preeminent universities in the United States, if not in the world, is the quintessential home of the power of knowledge and the ability to bring people into that space. So I teach law students, but for example, just a few weeks ago, I also taught a class at the undergraduate level for veterans who are thinking of coming back to college. And Harvard is also a place that invites people into this extraordinary world of knowledge and power. And so the double-edged sword is that it's an elite, powerful institution and therefore doubles down in some ways in that kind of hierarchy, which is by its very nature exclusionary. And yet at the same time, because it does open its doors, because it does welcome more people in, because it does make more things possible, it is also redistributive. It also shares knowledge. It shares opportunity. It shares possibility. And so we're always walking that edge between what is inspiring about Harvard and what, frankly, I think, and my co-editor, Professor Charles, it's one of the reasons we pulled this book together. We thought as professors at Harvard, we have not only this incredible opportunity, but frankly also an obligation to share. That is what makes Harvard great, that we are able not only to create knowledge, but also to share it. And so that's really the spirit of this book.
Yeah, because that was my next question. Why did America Unfinished need to be written?
Well, it started about 6 or 8 months ago. We were grappling. So Professor Charles and I have been colleagues for a long time, and we've been in this conversation for a long time. What does it mean to be a legal scholar, to have been an attorney and now be a legal scholar, to have the opportunity and the privilege of being at Harvard Law School, where you can create knowledge and bring people together in a way that can be influential or powerful? What is our responsibility at this moment when so much of the American legal governance infrastructure is contested and some of it is on fire, and some of the legal profession is on fire, and parts of Washington, D.C. are on fire? What's our responsibility? And the answer is we're supposed to do what we do, but better. We're supposed to do our scholarship, and we're supposed to do it better. We're supposed to share it more. We're supposed to step up more. We're supposed to do it with more people. And so it was that spirit that caused us to reach out to our entire faculty. And we said, we think this is a moment when we should be valuing our academic freedom and celebrating it by using it. We should recognize that it's a privilege. And so we should not just talk about having it. We should exercise it in this way. And it was really actually very inspiring. So many of our colleagues stepped up right away and said, absolutely, we think that we should be sharing our work at this moment. Does it mean that people have the answer? Of course not. But it means that we can share knowledge. And frankly, our colleagues, some of our colleagues have been working in their spaces for decades. They are the national experts. Some of them are the world experts in the things that they do. And our thought was everyone should have access to that. And so we pulled together the book as a response to this moment in American law and governance, but also, of course, in honor of the fact that it's our 250th anniversary, which should be a time for reflection, for rethinking. Are our old ways good ways? Should we change our habits? We often update ourselves on our birthday. Okay, what's working? What's not working? What do we need to do differently? So we really tried to embrace the moment in a way that might be helpful to and engaging for as many people as possible.
So I got a personal question. How come the preamble to the U.S. Constitution didn't make the cut? You got the Declaration in there. You got the Gettysburg Address. How come the good old preamble didn't make it?
Well, one of it was we did this very fast and had page limits. So we had to argue to get more space in the first place. You might expect, actually, from Harvard law professors that we would only have put the law in, that the Constitution, and there are, of course, many essays about the Supreme Court, about constitutional law in all kinds of spaces. But we wanted to be more encompassing than that. And because there's a lot of law you could put in, and there's a lot of law that we have in the essays, but we thought that so first of all, the 250th, it's the birthday of the Declaration. But also we thought that the Gettysburg Address captured something about the project that the legalism of the Constitution was part of, but might not fully convey. And the spirit of the book is in part to notice, yes, of course, law is central, but law is always working with all our other institutions: law, politics, education, culture, the economy, all pieces of our democracy. And so you're absolutely right. We could have put the preamble in, but actually we were trying to be more capacious, as it were, more imaginative, and include things that maybe wouldn't be quite so entirely straightforward.
Yeah, I that was my guide, and whenever people talk to me about legislative work, I think the preamble, first of all, you take an oath to uphold the Constitution when you go in these positions. But I think that preamble is the best guide because, first of all, you're establishing what the target is. You're trying to establish a more perfect union. And you make a commitment to defend the nation, you make a commitment to provide for the general welfare, and you make a commitment to protect individual liberty. As a legislator, that's your job, right? So I that's why I value that paragraph so much. It was like John Meacham was talking about the sentence in the Declaration of Independence was the most important sentence. I would argue that the preamble is the most important paragraph. And so, I just, like I said, that's personal for me, but we'll move on. I don't.
Well, how about we'll include it in volume 2? How about that?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I like to hear.
Of course.
All right. And Annette Gordon-Reed asked a question, so I'm going to ask it to you. Are we a democratic nation or a heritage nation?
Yeah. So look, if I could just celebrate that particular essay that you're drawing from for one moment. So as I said, there's 62 essays in this book from 62 different Harvard law professors, and Professor Gordon-Reed wrote one of the first essays in the book. It's called Making Americans a History. And of course, we're very fortunate to have Professor Gordon-Reed. She's one of America's most preeminent historians. And she takes us all the way back to the founding, to the roots of the argument. And it's a fascinating essay for your listeners. I hope people will take a look, especially at this one. And she takes us back as a historian to 250 years of fighting over this question. Who gets to be American? What do we mean when we say that we are American? And she shows us how this has been a tension from the very beginning between the idea of tribe, if you will, blood, legacy, what you might think of as the old school model, right? That's how monarchs become monarchs. That's how nobility becomes nobility, versus the idealism of what America could become. And of course, the idealism was not realized at the founding. It took many years for the notion of we the people to expand to actually include all of the people. And we could have an argument about how well it's even done that. There are essays about, have we done it yet? Are we there yet? Is everyone included? But Professor Gordon-Reed shows us that this has always been a fight. And we're seeing it now in the fight over immigration, in the violent over-enforcement of immigration across the country that has so shocked so much of America. And I think part of the shocking quality is not just the violence, although that violence is shocking, and it's not just the illegality, although so much of it is illegal. It's the ethos. It's the idea that we're going to be so cramped, so exclusionary, so narrow in our notion of who counts as American. And I think part of the outrage and the shock shows that actually a lot of Americans, that we don't agree, we think that we are inclusive. We think that we are one people under law. We don't think you have to be born in any particular place or speak any particular language or come from any, particular ethnicity. We don't agree with that. So Professor Gordon-Reed, I think, writes this beautiful historical essay explaining the arc of that argument that, frankly, we're having today, every day.
Do you feel that the current administration has damaged the concept of the rule of law?
So thank you for asking me that question, because it is what I write about in the essay for this book. So let's take a step back. In the criminal system, which is my area of expertise, rule of law has always been shaky for ordinary Americans. So when I was a public defender in Baltimore, as I have done my work and scholarship about the criminal system over and over again, we see how the criminal system abandons rule of law for ordinary people, for the vulnerable, for people who don't have the resources, the money, or the social capital to fight back. And so I think one of the things that's happening in our political discourse right now, in our legal discourse, is a kind of a romanticization of the American legal system as if somehow it was all working perfectly until this moment, and then the Trump administration broke it. And at least in the criminal system, I think there's a very clear story to be told about how that isn't the case. What is the case actually is that our system has been vulnerable to exploitation and abuse for a long time, and the administration is taking advantage of tools that were forged long ago. So as I explain in the essay, we now live in a world where pardons can be courted and purchased for millions of dollars, the presidential pardon power, where federal prosecutions are openly political. Embrace the idea of political reward and retribution. Now, in the world of criminal law and criminal scholarship, we all look at each other and we point out, it's always been kind of political. There's always been a political strand, a political valence to the way we have formed our criminal system. And many of us, including myself, have argued against what's unfair about this for a long time. But the openness, the sort of crass embrace of the idea that it's now okay, that it's okay to do this, that I think is an extreme version of what our criminal system has been, that we haven't seen before. The idea that an administration would openly embrace, as if it were okay, the politicization of the coercive power of the state. And to their credit, we have seen federal prosecutors across the country quit because they said, this is not the job I signed up for. And just to be clear, I was a federal public defender. My entire job was to fight with federal prosecutors. I was on the other side of the V. It was the United States versus my client. And I have been heartened by the wave of federal prosecutorial pushback against this open erosion of rule of law. Did I think they were doing a perfect job before? No. Did I, have I written critically about the politicization and the racialization of the criminal system? Yes. Do I think this is extreme? Absolutely.
Yeah. You ended your essay in the book with this statement: rule of law in the criminal system has always been elusive for the powerless. Now the rest of us are learning what that feels like. So my question to you is, how do we end the elusiveness?
You asked me a few questions ago what I thought would be a better world. And this is the answer to that question. If rule of law were truly, and let's back up for a second, because rule of law is one of those lawyerly professorial terms that I think, bears unpacking a little. What do we mean when we say something like that? We say it in law school all the time. What we mean is we have decided, indeed, the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to the Constitution, through those documents, through those commitments, we decided to run our country based on law and not on brute power. The old school, a sentence that captures this in many Supreme Court cases and the Massachusetts Constitution, in fact, is the idea that we are a government of laws and not of men. And the idea is, at the end of the day, we agree to do it by law and not the most powerful person in the room. The person with the biggest stick doesn't get to decide. The person with the most money doesn't get to decide. The king doesn't get to decide. It's not the Pope. At the end of the day, we're going to do it through law. And that puts a certain kind of constraint on power. Law enhances power, of course, but it is also a pushback, a constraint against power. And so rule of law is the promise that at the end of the day, we're going to do it by law and not just by power. And we're going to live with the outcome, even if we don't like it. And we can all think of outcomes that we don't like, but notice the radical nature of the idea that the most powerful person in the room with the biggest stick and the most money and the most troops and access to the most violence would say, okay, that's the answer. The law, the legal system has provided an answer, and I don't like it, and I'm going to live with it anyway. And there's something really profound about that move. Of course, a lot of people are comparing, this era to Bush v. Gore, when the Supreme Court handed down a decision that essentially that gave the election to President Bush and meant defeat for the candidate, then Vice President Al Gore. And many people have pointed out Al Gore did not deny the outcome. He didn't say, this is unfair, we should get rid of the Supreme Court. He said, oh, that's the law. The Supreme Court has made a decision, and I am going to abide by it. Even though, as powerful people go, he had a lot of, he had a lot of ammunition at his disposal, and he didn't use it. That's what rule of law is. And so let me take us back to Baltimore, which is my clients understood that law was not going to protect them if a Baltimore police officer decided that they didn't want to. And my clients understood that the law was not going to protect them if they lived in a neighborhood where the city council or some powerful developer or some other person with money or influence decided that they wanted that neighborhood to be one way and not another. They understood that the law was not going to be for them, which is a way of saying that rule of law had abandoned them. Whereas in wealthy communities, often, it used to be in federal court that many of those defendants, hedge fund managers and people on Wall Street and high-profile defendants, they might have been guilty as sin, but they knew the law would work for them. They were going to get to invoke the Fourth Amendment. They were going to get to argue about what the rules meant. They were going to get to use the law. The law was for them. So to me, a better world is one in which everyone who is hauled before the state or has a conflict in their life would know that this edifice, this infrastructure of law that we have built over 250 years is for them. Does it mean we will get the answer we want? No, it does not. But it means we're all playing by the same set of rules. And today, I think it's shockingly and abundantly obvious that the American people, we do not all get to play by the same set of rules.
Yeah. Should the Supreme Court be restrained, reformed, or remain status quo?
Great hot topic question. And I'm going to direct your listeners back because we have to the collection, because we have two extraordinary essays in hot disagreement with each other in the collection. There's a lot of disagreement in this collection. If you go through each people, perhaps it's not surprising that 62 Harvard law professors cannot agree on what the problems are, what we should do, or even what the question is. And this, of course, is one of the great questions of the moment. So the two essays, and I'll just flag them for your readers if they decide to take a look. In the section on the Supreme Court, there's a dozen sections on all different kinds of subjects in the book. But this one on the Supreme Court, there's an essay by two luminous constitutional law scholars. They are national experts in this space. And their essay is called Declaring Independence from Judicial Supremacy. And they argue essentially that the authority of the Supreme Court should be dismantled, that democracy should not be in the hands of 5 unelected Harvard and Yale graduates insulated from the political process, and that judicial supremacy is being abused and it should be ended, which is essentially an argument for restructuring the Supreme Court. And then the very next essay, also by a luminous constitutional law scholar of national repute, argues in an essay called A Court of Two Crises. He argues that even with the challenges and the politicization that we are seeing at the Supreme Court, and even though that so many people have lost faith in that institution, that it is still one of our most important bulwarks for protecting rule of law. And he goes through a list of we're well aware of the ways in which the Supreme Court has helped and supported the Trump administration. And he goes through and points out examples that we might not have noticed where the court either did not rule in favor of the Trump administration, or, as he points out, sometimes more importantly, protected the lower courts. When the lower courts ruled against the administration, or when the circuit courts ruled against the administration, they let those decisions stand, which is a big part of what the Supreme Court does. They interfere, they don't interfere. And he argues that if we do what the previous essay said we should do, which is mess with the court, that we will destabilize rule of law. And when we break that institution, there will be nothing standing between the politicized branches, particularly the executive, and full-on lawless authority. And so whatever you think of the answer, these two essays, I think, really illuminate what the key questions are. I learned an enormous amount from this collection, by the way. And, I like to think of myself as a pretty well-read person. I pay attention. But I learned so much from my colleagues, and it really deepened my understanding of what the issues on the table currently are, especially in this space.
Yeah. What do you want readers of America Unfinished to take away from it?
Great question. There's stuff we can do. And there's changes we can make. And we've been making changes for 250 years, and there's no reason to stop now. And it's not magic. The law is not magic. We teach this to our students. Is it complicated? Yes. Is it difficult? Yes. Can everybody wield it? No. Is it magic? No. There's no ghost in the machine. It's just laws passed by legislatures, enforced by courts, and argued about by lawyers, all of which is based on our national understanding of how our democracy is supposed to work. And so my hope from these 62 different essays, each one holds up a piece of this problem to the light. What about the Supreme Court? What about Congress? What about climate change? What about AI? What about war? And these essays show that maybe a way to say it is they show how law matters and also how it can be changed, that we are not written in stone. We are not written in granite. And as I flagged a little bit earlier, there's something daunting often and sometimes scary about these questions, that so much is at stake, so many lives are at stake. But at the same time, I hope that people will walk away realizing this is not, it's not impossible. It's just hard. But you know what? 250 years ago, breaking from Britain was no small feat. It was hard. We've been doing hard stuff the whole time. The Gettysburg Address, when Lincoln said it is for us, the living, to continue this unfinished work. What could be harder than ending slavery? And we did that. So I have to say that I am a little bit of a half full person. You can tell from the way I talk. I wouldn't keep doing this if I wasn't hopeful that law could matter. And I hope that when people read these essays, the ones that resonate with them, the ones that they're worried about, the ones they're interested in, they'll walk away thinking, there are things to be done. Things in my local community, things with my local legislature. I would consider this a wild success if someone decided to run for office who maybe hadn't, thought that there was a way to intervene before, or if students just read it. It's well designed as a curriculum because there's so many different pieces of the puzzle that it addresses, that students are inspired to become engaged. I'm not saying that they should go to law school, but they might realize, I could do that. That this is not magic. This is just thinking. This is just work. So I hope that the book is engaging and inspiring to people who are concerned about all the working parts of our democracy right now.
Yeah. All right. Finish this sentence. I have hope because.
I have hope because people. I had hope because people, when I was in the Baltimore City Detention Center lockup with my clients, they would run out of attorney meeting spaces because it was such a terrible, infested, awful facility. Nobody should have had to have been there for a minute. So sometimes I meet with my clients in a broom closet because that was the only place we could have a private conversation. And nobody wants to meet your public defender. Just like you never want to meet your oncologist. It means that it's the worst moment, one of the worst moments of your life. And so many times my clients were thoughtful, hardworking, responsible people who were in terrible places in their lives. And we would talk about this terrible moment for them, for their families, for their children. And we would work together on their case. So that's the worst case scenario. That's one of the worst things that can happen to a person charged with a federal crime. You're in a broom closet with your federal public defender in Baltimore trying to figure out what to do next. And yet they stood up. They were thoughtful. They were responsible. And that has given me hope for 20 years that if they can be intelligent and thoughtful and rational and try to do the right thing. They say, I have made a mistake, or I am in this terrible fix. What can you do for my family? How can you help my family weather this? Or how can you help me? And my colleagues in the Federal Public Defender's Office who took on terrible, impossible cases. And yet they fought to the very end, every paperclip, every piece of paper, because of the commitment that we see all the time in ordinary people, even under the most terrible circumstances, to stand up and try to do the right thing for themselves, for their families, for others, through the law, through their community. I think many of us were very moved and inspired and given hope by Minneapolis, when the people of Minneapolis, ordinary people, these are not these were not fancy people with a lot of money and big sticks and fancy degrees. And they looked around and they said, this is wrong. And they got in their minivans and they took their neighbors' children to school. How could you not be hopeful when people do that under terrible circumstances? So that's what makes me hopeful.
All right. So Alexandra Natapoff, thank you for doing this. How can people reach you, and how can people get the book?
So Harvard Law School, the website is public. There's only one Natapoff there. So if you Google my name, Natapoff, and my email is public, it's just on the website. There's also a page on the Harvard Law School website that is dedicated to this book, America Unfinished, with not just information about the book, but videos from different contributors talking about their essays, with free materials, other ways to delve into it. I think it's a really wonderful page that the school put together. The book itself is published by MIT Press. You can get it in any, whatever independent bookstore you like to go to, or any online outlet that you prefer to use. The one thing I would love to flag, last thing for your listeners, is that we are really thrilled that MIT Press has agreed that in 2027, this book will become open access, which means it'll be free for anybody who wants to read it. And we're really grateful to MIT Press for being willing to do this. They're the ones who are giving up the revenue. We are to the extent that there are any royalties, we're donating them to our local public library. So we're not receiving the money, but MIT Press is footing the bill for putting the book together. But they were willing to make this open access because it's so consistent with the spirit of the book. Everyone needs to be part of this conversation. These essays are short. They're 4 or 5 pages. Anyone can read them. There are no footnotes. We worked really hard to edit them to make them accessible. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be a law professor to read these essays. And we really wanted to make sure that this conversation was available and accessible to everyone. And so because MIT Press has so generously been willing to make this book open access in 2027, it means if you don't have, 20 odd bucks right now, and so many Americans, don't, don't have any extras lying around right now. It will be available. No one will be cut out of the conversation that this book is trying to be part of just because you don't have, $20 at the moment. So we're really grateful for that piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a pretty cool, noble gesture, because like you said, it's not a hard read. It's very easy because, like you said, the essays are no more than 4 or 5 pages and all that, but you can feel the depth of knowledge that each one of these contributors puts into the essay. And you understand why those people were asked to write their essays. So again, I just want to thank you for doing that, you collaborating with Mr. Charles to do that, and for coming on the podcast. I think it's important for my listeners to be exposed to people, and I always tell folks that, my guests are way smarter than I am. And so it's just always a privilege for me to bring those people onto the show. But this is a seminal work that you've put together. And I'm really, really glad to hear that it'll be available to everyone, because everyone needs to read it. And I think it's an appropriate reflection. I think you had made a statement earlier that every birthday we need to have a reflection about ourselves. And I think this book is a perfect reflection of where we are as Americans. So thank you again for doing the book and for being on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right, guys. And we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, we are back. So now it is time for my next guest, Dr. Bianca J. Baldridge. Dr. Bianca J. Baldridge is an associate professor of education with expertise in community-based education and critical youth work practice at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. As a sociologist of education, Baldridge's research explores the social political context, community-based youth work, and critically examines the confluence of race, class, and gender and their impact on educational reforms that shape community-based spaces, engaging Black and Latin youth. In addition, she explores the organizational and pedagogical practices employed by youth work professionals amid educational reforms and restructuring. Baldridge's first book, Reclaiming Community, Race, and the Uncertain Future of Youth Work, examines how racialized, market-based reforms undermine the efforts of Black community-based organizations to support comprehensive youth development opportunities. Her book received the 2019 Critics' Choice Book Award from the American Educational Studies Association. With the support of the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship Program, Baldridge investigated how racial disparity discourse influences community-based spaces that engage Black youth in predominantly white cities that espouse a liberal and progressive ethos. Her second book, Laboring in the Shadows, Precarity and Promise in Black Youth Work, examines the pivotal role of Black youth workers in the lives of young people and the challenges they face in an unstable and often underappreciated position. Current research examines broader issues of equity facing the out-of-school time sector nationally, the precarity of the youth work profession and how Black youth workers navigate anti-Blackness, and how Black community-based youth organizations respond to city change and displacement fueled by gentrification and educational restructuring. Baldridge's research appears in journals such as the American Educational Research Journal, Review of Research in Education, Teachers College Record, Educational Researcher, and Race, Ethnicity, and Education. Baldridge's experiences as a youth work professional in U.S. cities and abroad also profoundly inform her research. With a deep commitment to engage, research, and disrupting oppressive youth development spaces, Baldridge works with several out-of-school time networks and facilitates communities of practice with organizational leaders and youth development professionals nationwide to sustain justice-oriented and humanizing youth work practices. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Dr. Bianca J. Baldridge. All right, Dr. Bianca Baldridge. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing really well.
Well, I'm really glad to have you on the podcast because I came across your profile in LinkedIn and I said, oh yeah, I got to get this sister on the show. I gotta at least pick her brain a little bit, especially with education.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, ma'am. So you understand, there's three people that I admire the most in the world. There are social workers, veterans, and educators.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, that my social worker friends say that social workers run the world. I get that. But, I think those three professions are vital for society. Yeah. I think there are other professions have their place, but I think if we're going to make it, it's going to be the social workers, the educators, and then the veterans to protect us from everybody else. So let's go ahead and get this thing started. I do a couple of icebreakers. And so the first icebreaker is a quote that I want you to respond to. And the quote is, "The freedom to study how a society built on both slavery and equality moved, however unevenly, toward broader rights is not a luxury. It is part of what makes the United States worth celebrating. Attempts to ban or sanitize honest teaching about slavery, Reconstruction, and civil rights do not defend American exceptionalism. They undermine it."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My response to that, actually, it reminds me of James Baldwin's quote about to be educated, right, in a society is to be able to question, right, America. And so, for me, it's all about, and especially working with young people live in the same world that we live in. So they have an understanding of societal harms. They may not have the language that adults might use, but they understand what's going on. And so I'm always, you got to be able to live in truth. And I think young people understand that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now the next icebreaker is what I call 20 questions.
Ooh, okay.
So I need you to give me a number between 1 and 20.
13.
All right. Do you think there is such a thing as unbiased news or media, and why?
Unbiased news. I don't think many things are unbiased or objective, right? I think how we raise questions, how we analyze things, how we make sense of things are often filtered through how we understand ourselves and how we think about the world. But do I think that you can do a job of presenting, right, information without opinion? Sure. I think there's ways to do that, right? Journalists get trained in that. As a researcher, right, I'm trained to sort of take data, to sort of think about it in ways that are true to what the data is telling me, but that is still all very much filtered through who I am. So I guess it's a yes and no.
I understand. Where on your journey of life did you decide to be an educator?
This might be embarrassing, but I remember being in the first grade and lining up my stuffed animals, pretending to teach them. I knew that I always wanted to do something with education. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. I had amazing Black women teachers, and I admired them. And so I wanted to mimic them, like mimic what I saw. I loved learning. And so I knew that I always wanted to do something in education. So probably first grade. And then that shifted a bit as I went into middle school and high school, and understood that I loved teaching. I loved working with young people, but it didn't necessarily need to be in school. Right. And I started doing work and teaching and facilitating and work with young people outside of school context. So first grade is where it all began. Thanks to Miss Walford.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Cause like I tell people, my journey in politics started when my parents bought me a set of World Book encyclopedias at 3. And
Wow.
I found this page. It was a 2-page spread of pictures. And I said, I want to be one of these pictures up here. And that was the spread for President of the United States. And then, of course, you flip the pages and it went into detail about what the office is and all that. But it was like, you had me sold on the portraits. I wanted one of those portraits, right? So, of course, I didn't get to be president, but it started me on my journey in politics. So now I always believe in a superhero origin story. And so what was your moment, right? And when you decided to do what you do. So that's cool that you had the little animals lined up and stuff.
I love that. I love that. And you mentioned encyclopedias. Like I remember encyclopedia salesmen like coming to the door. I'm old enough to know that when they would sell it from door to door. I remember my parents getting them.
Yeah. The kids don't understand that. They don't get it. As a matter of fact, the guy who was really, I think the last Democratic governor for the state of Mississippi, Ronnie Musgrove, when he was a young man trying to make a little extra money, that's what he was doing, selling encyclopedias. Our children can't even imagine that. It's like, you mean the app that I could put on the phone, people were actually selling these books? Yes, they were doing it. And our parents were buying them. That's right. Yep. All right. In the introduction to the book, Laboring in the Shadows, you said youth workers, the volunteer, part-time, and full-time staff in these programs are essential to American social, political, economic, and educational life. Why do you believe that?
Oh, I believe that for many reasons that actually you mentioned in your introduction in thinking about social workers, and I think you mentioned veterans and educators. There are groups of workers in our society that literally help society function. And I believe that youth workers are one of them, though they're often invisible and not always mentioned alongside classroom teachers. So youth workers, again, are the professionals who work in nonprofit youth serving organizations, community-based serving organizations, those that might be identified as after-school programs, whether they are run by school districts or independent programs, independent organizations across the country. And so when you think about young people spending time in school, they only spend about 18% of time in school. Some of my colleagues, fellow sociologists, have studied this, right? Which means that if 18% of their time is spent in school, they spend about 41% of time sleeping, which means their waking hours is another 40%. And so during that time, they are doing things like leisure activities, being at home, chores, and extracurricular activities. So spending time outside of school, engaging with their peers, or some kind of other forms of activities during non-school hours, right? Which means that parents are allowed to work, right? So when parents are allowed to work beyond the school hours, that is serving our economy, right? They can be into the workforce. Youth workers also support our school systems. Many community-based youth serving organizations, or how I talk about them in my work, community-based educational spaces, they are often making up for what schools lack, what they can't provide, or what they refuse to provide. Right? And so you have youth workers who are in many ways filling in the gap and meeting young people, not as part of their family, not as part of their school, but they're these other group of people that are supporting the social, political, educational development of young people. And so I don't think this is too much to say, but I do think that on some level, society would collapse, right? If you didn't have spaces where young people could go after school. And those places that they're going after school, they are staffed by youth workers, right? By people who love young folks, who are working to ensure that they're okay, that they are safe. And then also thinking about the number of resources that might be provided. to young people. So many youth serving organizations are serving meals, right? Providing young people with snacks after school, and they may not have eaten that day, right? So it's essential labor that I argue is often in the shadows, right? Hence the title of the book, Laboring in the Shadows, that these organizations, these programs that support young people and their families are kind of everywhere, right? In many ways. So you think about our national youth serving organizations, the Boys and Girls Club, the Y, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, like those are national programs, but there are so many independent grassroots programs that are not tethered to national networks. But then you also have work that's taking place in faith-based communities, right? Or in parks, museums, libraries, right? So youth workers are really everywhere, right? They're doing this labor. And I would suggest that they're often hidden in plain sight, right? We interact with them, but we may not know that that's what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, but I don't think that's an extreme statement as far as to say that the society would collapse, because all through our history, there's always been programs to try to keep us out of trouble, right?
Yeah.
Boy Scouts,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
The Little League Baseball, the police action, athletic league, all these things were set up. You mentioned Boys and Girls Clubs. Those were all things to try to keep us from getting into trouble and doing anything, that little kids or teenagers, or especially middle school kids. I didn't realize how bad middle school kids were until I got older. It was like, I was like, was I that bad at 12 and 13? Because it was like we didn't have middle school in Chicago. It was like you went from kindergarten to eighth grade. So maybe that minimized the damage we could do. I don't know, because we were like upperclassmen in that school. But
it's a special time.
Man,
it is a special time of development, for sure. For sure. I spent some time, working in nonprofits with middle school students, sixth graders, seventh graders, and eighth graders. And they're cool in the sense that they will tell you the truth, right? Like they have no filter. But which is part of the reason why I think youth work is really important, is because what's happening at that age, right? They're beginning to question their parents, which is why they talk back a lot, right? They're awkward, right? So they're coming into their bodies. They're trying to recognize and name like the many different kinds of emotions that they're feeling. And there's often not a space for that in traditional schools. And so when I think about the nonprofit sector, right? And youth workers who are able to think about like, all right, middle school kid, right? Like you're going through this, you're going through that, you're going through this. Let's kind of think about all that together, right? And so I find that the youth workers who engage that population, they have their work cut out for them, but they also tend to enjoy it because you're meeting multiple needs of young people. And it feels like they all converge at the middle school level for sure.
Let's get off the horror of middle school kids. Let's explain deficit framing versus strength-based approach.
Yeah. So actually, in thinking about what you just mentioned around how and why these programs exist, right? We kind of have to think about the ways that young people, right? The category of a young person, of youth, the way that they are framed in our society. And when we think about teenagers, we think about preteens, there's all these narratives around like how quote unquote bad they might be, or like troublemakers. I remember growing up and my mother had a refrigerator magnet that said, "You don't scare me, I have teenagers," right? So it's always like, young people are sort of meant to be kind of controlled, right? We're supposed to follow directions and all of that. And so at the time of even just the emergence of after school programs, when women, right, had to go into the workforce, children run unsupervised. So there's always been this language around, we got to keep kids occupied. We got to keep them occupied and off the streets. Otherwise, they're going to get into vagrancy. And so let's put some structure to this out of school time. So a lot of that has sort of carried into programming today. And I've argued throughout my career in the ways that it's been classed, but then also racialized, right? So you get this framing, particularly around young people of color, primarily Black and Latina young people living in poverty, that if they're not occupied, right, they're going to roam around the streets and they're going to terrorize the neighborhood. And so it becomes this. So then community organizations then become these spaces of containment for Black and brown kids. And I've spent a lot of my career kind of rejecting that, because that gets into these ideas of what they're perceived to be lacking or deficit, right? And so in youth programming, you get frames that, oh, these kids are at risk, they're broken, they need to be fixed. And I think on the surface, that language doesn't appear to be kind of this like negative framing. But when you think about it, it's like, well, at risk of what, right? It often puts the blame on individuals and on culture, and not in what's lacking in institutions and what's on sort of structural problems that sort of create the conditions that young people and, individuals are trying to navigate. And so that deficit framing throughout my career, I've really sort of pushed back on it as it pertains to Black education and Black youth, because a lack of or something that's different is not deficient. And the language around youth work that is deficit oriented positions these organizations as their saviors, as something to be fixed. And also that kind of, I think, takes away from their humanity, right? And it becomes that these organizations are only set up for, kids of color, right? Black kids or poor kids, when all young people, right, deserve opportunities to be engaged after school. The strengths-based approach, on the other hand, is really not looking at what's lacking, but what is already held, right, by young people. What are their talents? What are their gifts? What has their family and their communities poured into them? And that the different approach to that is thinking about organizations who can look at a young person and say, I see you. I see you're already brilliant. I see you're already whole. I'm just here to help. I'm here to enhance what you already have. I'm here to maybe expose you to the things that you want to learn about, or things that you may not have access to, but there's nothing wrong with you as a person. I think much too often, particularly in the education system, we look at young people as problems. And in the youth workspace, particularly Black and Latina young people, they're looked as problems. And I don't see young people as problems, right? I see them as joy. I see them as brilliance. I see them as needing opportunities, needing to be heard. And so I think that approach, coming from a strength-based approach, is much, much better than a deficit approach. And again, I can't emphasize enough how sort of the field of youth work has come a long way in acknowledging this, right? And it's taken not only my work, but like lots of people before me who have said, like, we have to frame this work in different ways, right? Again, we're not fixing anybody. We're not saving anybody. We are responding to structural conditions, right? Like, these programs exist, right, because of failures like in society, not because anything is inherently wrong or deficient about young people or their families or communities.
You recently said Black communities have always found ways to educate, nurture, and prepare Black youth for the world. Give an example of this resilience.
Yeah, I love that question. And I'll say that, to give a little context to my answer, what I try to do in my book, Laboring in the Shadows, is connect contemporary Black youth workers who are engaging in organizations with young people today to a longer history of communal care and resistance and survival within Black communities. And so I often point to the example of the Black Panther Party, right? And their labor and their education work with young people. So programs like the Free Breakfast Program, thinking about their community and survival conferences, the ways in which they would emphasize critical consciousness and social awareness for young people, right? That kind of political education work even precedes them, right? Like, we've always found ways to nurture, protect, and educate young people. I think even before then, I talk about in the book Mary McLeod Bethune and the work of the youth administration and the work that she did for Black youth in finding employment opportunities and opportunities for civic engagement, right? So there's always been the work, right, of whether it's informal, whether it's, grandparents at the kitchen table, whether it's a formal organization like the National Youth Administration led by Mary McLeod Bethune, or whether it's the Black Panther Party, right? There's always been an effort to not only educate young people, right? So in terms of what's happening in schools, but also and prepare them for the world that they were going to inhabit and how the world was going to see them. And it's often, right, as Black people, less than human or as a problem, right? So how to navigate like white supremacist institutions, right? How to sort of carry yourself in the world. All of that is a part of the education, right? So education is not just schooling, right? It's also how to show up in the world, how to navigate the world. And that's just always been essential to Black communities, right? I think about growing up in South LA, right? I got talked to by my parents, by my uncles, by my aunts, cousins about, how the world was going to perceive me, right? That was an education that I took with me into the classroom when I went to college. Went to UC Berkeley, right? As, how to prepare for that, right? As a Black student and being one of few Black students on campus in a predominantly white institution. How was I going to understand who I was, right? As a Black woman in that space. So that kind of education is not only essential to Black youth work, but it's always been a part of Black educational practice.
Yeah. And that's something that I guess try to wrap my mind around a lot of times. UCal, Berkeley, Northwestern schools,
Mm-hmm.
even Harvard, I remember going to visit my friend who went to Northwestern. And I remember seeing I guess they had the dorms where the cafeterias were in the dorms. And so
Mm-hmm.
all the Black students that lived in that dorm sat at that one table.
Yep.
And I have to remind myself that I was spoiled. I went to Jackson State. And
Okay.
so when I listen to you and my friends and other folks talk about your experiences at these colleges, it's like, oh yeah, that's right. There wasn't that many of them around there. It's like they all hung out together. It was just weird to see all the AKA sitting next to the Delta, sitting next to the Sigma Gamma Rho, and then the Q, and they were all sitting at the same lunch table. And,
Yep.
and I was just like, wow, yeah. So I have to keep, when you said what you said, that's what triggered that about Berkeley. It was like, yeah, I guess there wasn't a whole lot of Black kids when she was there at Berkeley.
Yeah.
Okay. Robin D.G. Kelly said, the catalyst for political engagement has never been misery, poverty, and oppression, but the promise of constructing a new world. Do you agree with that statement and why?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely adore the work of Robin D.G. Kelly and was so thrilled that he was able to blurb the book. And his notions of freedom dreaming is so is so important to me in many ways. So being trained as a sociologist, I can talk all day about social conditions and structures and systems of inequality. And I do that. I can do that well. I love doing that. I love to be able to point out, right, the ways in which structural oppression sort of shapes our lived experiences. I love doing that. But also recognizing that there has to be room for not only what I want to tear down, but also what I want to build, what I want to create, what I want to imagine, right? What the vision is. And so the importance of activists, right? I mean, this is, drawing on Kelly's work and thinking about the systems we might be tearing down, but what's going to be in its place? What questions do we have, right? What is our imagination? What is it that we want to see? And what I think is so powerful about youth work, particularly in Black space, and I should have said this at the beginning, but I've been a youth worker since I was 15, right? So I have always worked alongside young people and it did that all the way through, my graduate program. And as a professor now, there's ways that I engage young people, youth workers and program leaders around the country. But that process of being able to imagine a future, to be able to dream, to be able to create and build is so essential, I think, and life affirming for young people. And to be able to have to create space, to create opportunities for young people to dream and to imagine beyond what they think is possible is really crucial, right? It's really, really crucial to building the world that we want to see. And so whether it's the idea of freedom dreaming, whether it's sort of sparking creativity or thinking about not only what you're going to tear down, but what you're going to build, that process is really important. And I also think it makes room for critical hope. So as I was writing the book, but doing the research for the book was collected really at various periods of crises and struggle, right? So one of the case studies in the book is a city, a Midwestern city, where 75% of Black youth live below the poverty line, right? Where there was police violence against young Black people, where there was violence on the part of white teachers, in attacking Black students. And then another period, so 2020, right? So in the onset of COVID, as well as what Robin D.G. Kelly calls Black Spring. So the uprisings against police brutality and the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Think about Ezekiel Ford, Tony McDade, right? And the list goes on and on and on. All this was happening while I was interviewing people. And while they're witnessing sort of the loop of Black death in the media over and over and over again, they were also out protesting. They were, in Zoom school. They were, surviving and trying to sort of sustain their life, but also still hopeful for change. And I use the word critical hope, and I'm borrowing from various scholars, including Jeff Duncan Andrade, who talks about critical hope in the sense that it's not a dismissal or not that you don't acknowledge systemic oppression or white supremacist forces, but it's recognizing, right, that change can happen, right? Or that we can sort of push back, right, on inequality. So that it's a critical hope. And I think that process is just extremely important, right? To have this both and, to have this awareness of the systems and forces that sort of shape our lives and that can constrain our lives, but also to remain visionary, right? As our ancestors did. Right? Like, as our ancestors did, right? Like, the fighting and the survival, all of that, but wishing, right, for a better tomorrow for those who came behind them. Like, that's why I do what I do, right? Is I want to make this better for those who are behind me. And to do that, like, I can't lose, that critical hope. I can't lose that sense of imagination or that visioning and the ability to dream, right, of something different.
Yeah. How can the American education system be reconstituted to fulfill the promise of constructing a new world?
Ooh, that's a good question. And I think it's part of the reason why I work outside of the school system in many ways. And let me break that down a little bit, right? Because I do think that when we think about schooling, right, in American society and the exclusion of Black folks, right, the degradation and exclusion of Native folks and Indigenous folks, right, we have to sort of think about the education system in that way and the ways that it wasn't designed, right, for us. And so because of that, there are mechanisms and processes within school systems that continually fail, right, our kids. And in many ways, I think that's by design. That said, right, there are schools and school systems and educators who are brilliant and sort of, working and supporting young people. As a sociologist of education that studies outside of school, that studies community organizations that in many ways are a complement or a supplement to school, what I would envision, right, to really kind of make this better, right, is to think about what's happening in the out of school sector, what's happening in youth workspaces, to bring that to in connection and in partnership to what's happening in schools. And that's not to say that what's happening in community-based educational spaces needs to fold into what's happening in schools, but to recognize them both, right, as separate entities, but entities that could come together to support the optimal development of young people. And I say this for a couple of reasons, just to kind of give you some concrete examples. In many schools of education, there are teacher education programs, right? When I was on the faculty at UW-Madison, I had a colleague who sent her pre-service teachers not into the classroom first for their training. She sent them to community-based youth serving organizations to work alongside youth workers to learn how to connect with young people, right? So in schools, there are often constraints and constraints and, teachers having to teach to the test and all these things, and their jobs are extremely difficult. But oftentimes there's not a sort of time, or the ways in which sometimes teachers are sort of put in this position of authority and having all the power. Whereas in youth work, not all the time, but for the most part, youth workers are able to connect with young people without some of the barriers that teachers face, right? And so it's not lost on me that many schools of education are looking to community-based youth serving organizations and youth workers for how to connect with young people, how to think about whole child development, right? That academics are important, but also social, emotional support is also important. So when I think about how we might transform the education system, I think we have to learn from all educators, right? Young people have many educators in their lives. That includes their families. That includes youth workers. That includes classroom teachers. That there are multiple spaces of learning. That's not just the school walls, right? It's what's happening in parks, what's happening on their blocks, right? What's happening in their faith-based communities. All that is important. So I really think it's important in particular for youth workers, program leaders to be in conversation, right, with classroom teachers and school administrators. I'll give you one more example. So at the beginning of COVID, I had one Twitter rant, back then. And there were all these conversations about what was going to happen in the fall, right? Because the onset of the pandemic came in March. And so there was all this panic about what was going to happen with schools. So there were these panels and all these conversations and school principals and teachers and all these people. And I'm like, this is great, but you're not doing this alone. Young people have community organizations they go to after school. Do you know where your kids are going after school? Right? So what's happening in those spaces? What can we learn? How can we partner? And as we saw, there were libraries that were opening their spaces to provide internet services, right, to young people. You have folks who are, pivoting and working in parks, right? I think about San Francisco that, created these learning hubs to support the kids of essential workers, right? So you had parks and recreation coming together with libraries, coming together with nonprofit youth serving organizations to make sure that young people could learn, right? So it's just, youth workers have always been there. They're also exemplary at care work, and in particular, care in crises. And so I think we have to learn from each other. We have to be able to pull like what's wonderful and beautiful about schools and what's wonderful and beautiful about community organizations and be able to talk to each other. But that also requires, right, school systems and classroom educators to see youth workers as educators, right, as pedagogues, even if they don't have the same kind of degrees or training in the way that they think is needed, right? So I just think that's really important for us to just really think about young people's broader ecosystem of learning, that it's not just schools. It's never been just schools. It's never been just that, right? So we have to really learn from young people's broader ecosystem of development and the people, the educators who are in that ecosystem.
So I forgot to ask you the Harvard question. I'll get back to that. But since you're on this flow, in the context of changing the American educational system, was the dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education a good thing or a bad thing?
Dismantling? You mean under this current administration?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. There's so much to say. One, I think it's a bad thing, right? I think there's a lot of infrastructure that has been established that has been undone. I often think about protections for students and for teachers that are completely undermined now. That is a disservice and heartbreaking in many ways. I mean, I think there's just so much to rebuild. And this is not to say, right, because, as a sociologist of education, I have lots of critiques, right, of the way, the federal government, treats education and the way that things are set up. I have lots of criticisms for sure. But also I think about the infrastructural support, like for one, in thinking about students with disabilities and the protections, right? Like how all those things get undermined. It's just a really dangerous position that we're in. So no, it's not a good thing at all.
Yeah, because you're based on that answer, you're more about the foundations of what was good and build on that instead of just scrapping the whole project and starting from scratch. And I mean, you'll get arguments from either way, but I respect what you're saying as far as it's not a good thing. I agree. It's not a good thing, but you know, because you're a visionary person, I wanted to pick your brain on that, which leads me back to the Harvard question. So why is Harvard an important American institution, especially as it pertains to your profession?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think so. I've been at Harvard I think I just finished my 4th year there. As I mentioned, I was on the faculty at UW-Madison before that for a while, for several years. I don't, let me answer this in a couple ways, maybe without losing my job. But I mean, I think that sort of universities in general, right? Like they are important in terms of the knowledge that gets produced. And I think that's absolutely important and critical. And I've been working in universities for a very, very long time for that reason, right? The knowledge production, the learning and all of that. I mean, I think that Harvard as being one of the, being considered one of the best institutions in the country and in the world, that's not lost on me. And I will also say, I think there are many universities throughout the country where there are brilliant minds, brilliant thinkers, brilliant scholars who are pushing forward new knowledge that help us, right, as a society, not only solve complex problems in ways that are creative and, so I think all universities not all universities, but many universities can get that credit. What I do think is special about Harvard, and I'll just kind of brag on where I'm situated, which is the School of Education, is that you do get various approaches to solving complex educational problems, which are deep social and political problems as well. And this is something that I often say to my students, right? And it's, going back to your question about the Department of Education, we have created a mess, like complicated, complex, interconnected, systemic problems as it relates to education in America. And so I don't believe in like one thing, like a silver bullet, like one solution fixing multiple, like complex social problems, right? And so what I appreciate about Harvard, in particular the Graduate School of Education, is that I have colleagues who are working in many different dimensions of education. So whether it's policy, whether it's, thinking about storytelling and the power of storytelling to create change, or, there's so many different avenues and ways in which people are tackling, right, educational and social problems. And so that's important to me. And I think whether it's a Harvard question or a university question, I think it's in general the ways that scholarship can influence social change. And then being in an education school and being a sociologist that is, I always say that I, have a foot in the community. And that's exactly where I want to be. Like I never want to abandon what got me to where I am. And for me, that's community, that's young people, that's youth workers. And so I appreciate universities that honor and celebrate community engagement and that are also honest, right, about the harm that they've caused as universities, right? So I think about Harvard's Legacy of Slavery project and other kinds of projects where you have to be sort of accountable, right, to the harm that you've caused in the past, whether you were there to create it or not, right? As a part of an institution that has this legacy, it's important to address. So I appreciate that as well. But I would say my overall answer is universities in general, including Harvard, bring together really, really brilliant minds that hopefully understand and that like not one idea, not one theory, not one method, right, is going to solve the complexity of the problems that we have in this country.
Yeah. So I want to be cognizant of your time. I've got 2 questions
Okay.
left. So if you want to, well, okay. How does police violence impact education?
Oh, yeah. In many ways. So I don't think you can talk about education without talking about other social issues and forces and systems. So I don't think you can talk about schools without talking about policing in this country. I have many colleagues who sort of study the parallels, right, between the prison system and the education system, or the carceral logics that right exist within schools. And so while this is not like my research area, I'm very much have always been concerned. It can sort of point to the ways in which carceral logics enter classrooms, enter sort of the ways in which young people can and can't move within schools, right? The ways in which they are surveilled, the ways in which they are physically attacked, right? The ways in which they are silenced and often policed for the ways that they show up, their physical appearance, to what they say. All of that, right, is deeply connected for sure. Some of my favorite scholars who sort of talk about the carcerality and the connections between education and schooling. I think about Damien Sojourner. His book, First Strike is incredible. In that way, I think about, David Stovall, you mentioned Chicago. It's one of my favorites, and sort of just thinking about the relationship, right, between sort of the prison industrial complex and education. So there's absolutely lots of parallels. When I was at UW-Madison, I taught a course on youth education and society, and we had an entire section on carceral logics and thinking about what many scholars have termed not the school to prison pipeline per se, but a nexus, right? In the ways in which it's deeply embedded, right? Yeah, I think about David Turner at UCLA, who has done incredible work with organizing Black and brown young men in their fight against police violence, right, in schools and within communities in South Central Los Angeles. So there's just tons of brilliant work out there on this topic, but the connections are real for sure. And again, always deeply concerned about the carceral logics that sort of seep into education in ways that we may not even fully recognize, right? And that sometimes has shown up in youth work as well, in terms of policing the bodies of young people, policing the sexuality, of young people, particularly black women and girls. And so, I always encourage anybody who works with young people, whether you're in schools and out of schools, I always ask them to sort of question like why they ask young people to do certain things and where it comes from. Right. When we are struggling for power and authority over young people, right? Like that logic of like, I need to have this power. I need to have like this kind of authority over young people and their bodies and what they say and what they do. For me, is very carceral, right? And I don't know that we always think about it in that way. And, I mentioned this earlier. I mean, I think that there are ideas we have about young people as a just category, right? As a population, for sure. And then when you add in race and class and gender, right, there's more that gets added into that. And so I think we really have to sometimes pause, right? And for sure, absolutely sort of reflect, like deep critical reflection on why we do the things we do, why our schools look particular ways, like why we are in such a quest for power and authority, right, over young people as though they can't make decisions for themselves, Yeah.
Yeah, and part of it is just exterior too, because if you go to Jackson, Mississippi, I don't know if you've ever been, but there's two high schools.
I haven't.
So one high school is built like right, literally across the street from a cemetery, and one they put like a barbed wire fence around the school, and I was just like, I couldn't do nothing about the high school that was across from the cemetery because that was historical from black folks settling in everything was in one spot because the elementary school is right next to the high school, right? But at the other high school, they have the barbed wire fence. We were challenging the superintendent, who was a black man. It's like, why would you do that? Well, we got to protect the students. So don't you have like magnetometers in the school? Don't you have like police officers? Well, we don't want to trespass it. It's like, it's a school. It's a school. It's like my old high school in Chicago doesn't have a barbed wire fence. It's got a fence, but it's not barbed wire. You know what I'm saying? A barbed wire fence
Yeah, man.
sends a message.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Absolutely. I mean, a big message, right? That, and then I don't know if you've seen some of the schools that will have making sure that students stay on a particular color in the hallway, right? So they're literally tracking students. I'm like, that we're talking about prison. Like, it's just like what's happening?
Towing the line. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's crazy. All right, let's get off of that. How is joy a form of resistance?
Love this question. I think, joy for me is not just sort of an emotion, right? Or, it is an emotion, but it's not just that. And I think there are times when, taglines like joy and resistance, like it feels like it's just something that people say. But I really think it's deeper than that, particularly when you're thinking about Black life, Black survival. And I think about Black joy as a part of this idea of both and, right? That Black folks are fighting, we're working, right? We're surviving, we're thriving, like all those things. And right through injustice, through white supremacy, through deep anti-Blackness, there's community, right? There's creativity, there's art, there's culture, right? Like all these things get produced that bring joy in the midst of struggle and pain, right? And suffering. And that's, I'm always like, I wouldn't want to be anything other than Black, right? The idea of making a way out of no way, or, laughing to keep from crying, like those kinds of things. Like, not that you shouldn't cry, right? Like, but like holding all those things together at once is deeply, it's always been important to the work that we do in the world. And so when I think about activism within Black communities, when I think about education in Black communities, when I think about political organizing in Black communities, there's always a form of joy present, right? And I think it's sustaining, right? It's like through the struggle, through the pain, all of that, we're going to create, we're going to laugh, we're going to build. And it doesn't mean that the suffering isn't happening, right? As we're working against that, but it also means that joy is present too. And in my book, I found that, the interviews that I did, youth workers were, you know, though they were alongside young people protesting, right, the murder of George Floyd, right, in those conversations and helping young people process and literally like try to make sense of everything that they were experiencing, there might be music involved. There might be food involved. There might be, other forms of connection and joy and laughter and fellowship that is sustaining, right? And that is allowing young people and youth workers to get through the day, right? To get through the week, to get through the month, right? That's just so important. So I see it as a life force. I see it as sustaining. I see it as respite, right? From the everyday of every day. And the sort of desire to keep going, right? That there's joy present, right? Amid the pain and suffering that might happen. I'm thinking about like Frankie Beverly and Mays, like the joy and pain, right? Like sunshine and rain, right? Like it really goes together in many ways. And even as a Black academic, like that, the joy sort of also keeps me from going into the depths of despair. And I find that it can be really easy to do that, like given all that we're faced with. Yeah, it prevents me from going to the depths of despair as well. So yeah, I'll just end there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So finish this sentence. I have hope because.
Because my elders had hope for me.
Okay. All right. So Dr. Bianca Baldridge, how can people reach out to you? How can people get this book, Laboring in the Shadows, or any other book that you have written?
Yeah.
How can they do that?
Yep. So I have two books. My first book, Reclaiming Community. My second book is Laboring in the Shadows. You can get that anywhere you buy books online. So they're both from Stanford University Press. So you go to Stanford University Press. You can go to Bookshop and support your, favorite local bookstore. Amazon, Barnes and Noble online as well. To stay in touch with me, I'm Bianca Jontae, Bianca Jontae on all social media.
Well, Dr. Bianca J. Baldridge, thank you for doing this. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I was teasing you about the obsession with youth workers, but it's really cool that there's somebody that really has a passion for people that have a passion, right? And I really commend you for being that scholarly voice for those folks doing that kind of work. And I just really am humbled that you took the time out in the middle of your conference to do this podcast. I greatly appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah. Dakota Irby speaks so highly of you. So he was on your podcast maybe last year.
Yeah. So and he's now, do you have a hidden talent like Dakota and you're a musician or anything like that? Or
I can make playlists. I had a very short stint DJing, but I absolutely love music. So I collect vinyl. Yeah, jazz, funk, soul.
Okay.
That's kind of what I love. So, but I don't have any talent like Dakota.
I got you. Well, I don't know now if you were DJing now. I don't know this. DJing now is not the same as DJing when I was in high school. Yeah.
Right. Short stints. Very short.
I feel. Well, look, again, thank you for doing this. The rule is you have an open invitation. So if you write another book, whatever, anything that you want to get off your chest, once you've been on the show, you have an open invitation to come back. So I would be honored if you accepted that opportunity and came back on. So just let me know and we'll make that happen.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Erik.
All right, guys. We're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right. And we are back. And so I want to thank Alexandra Natapoff and Dr. Bianca J. Baldridge for coming on the podcast. Incredible interviews. Enjoyed the conversations. Very, very relaxed. I mean, I try to tell people that I'm not in this gotcha game. I invite people on to give their opinions. And, it seems like the overwhelming majority of people that come on, we at least are within the same political tribe. But it's not because I exclude other people. It's just the way it works. And I've had folks on the other side come on too. And I hope they can tell you that it was a very relaxed environment. They came on and, wasn't, I wanted somebody to beat up on or somebody to fuss at. I just want to hear your viewpoint. And the main thing I used to tell them sometimes is like, you have this audience that maybe you won't normally reach. Try to convince them your point of view. And it seems like that strategy has worked out pretty good. But these two interviews were very, very relaxing. And it's just the way my schedule is now to get people to come on. I'm extremely grateful. There's a lot of stuff going on, especially in the summer, and now school is coming back in. So, for people who actually teach for a living, this is a real hectic time because they're trying to get their classes situated, kind of get a feel for how their students are and go from there. So for Professor Natapoff and Professor Baldridge, again, thank you for coming on the podcast. Enjoy the conversations. Really, really did. Anyway, I want to quickly touch on something that really kind of falls in where my mindset is this week, and then get into what I want to say about a thought that I had. So allegedly, Mitch McConnell is, as you heard in the news report, has been moved from this rehab center he was at to now he's supposed to rehab at home. And according to the statement that allegedly he said that he should be rejoining the Senate shortly. Well, here's the thing about that. The election to replace him is going to take place in November. And then, unless he wants to make some grand farewell or something, in December, is he really coming back before January? So there's a lot of people on my side of the fence that think he's dead already. And for whatever reason, they're just kind of prolonging it so the governor won't. We've gone past the deadline for him to appoint somebody. So now, they just, if they do decide they're going to announce to the world that he has passed away, then it'll be some kind of special election. At this particular point, if you have a special election, I mean, by the time you count the votes for that one, campaign, count the votes, and then if it's a runoff, the person that replaces him will literally be a senator for like 30 days or less. So, I like the way Governor Andy Beshear has handled it. Some people were like saying, well, he needs to demand this and it. Andy Beshear said, look, I would think that since I'm the governor of the state, the least that Senator McConnell could do is that if he's talking to everybody else, it'd be sure nice if he talked to me. And, I would go even further and say maybe he needs to let the president know that he's still alive too. So, but then Governor Beshear turned around and said, if he doesn't and he stays away from the Capitol, then that helps my folks in Washington. And it helps the Democrats because, we only need a couple of senators to go our way that's Republican instead of, instead of 4, now we only need 3. So if he doesn't want to call me, fine. But I would think since I'm the governor and he's the U.S. senator and it's his health that is denying us representation in the Senate, at least he would have given me an update. Let me know. So I think Beshear handled it the way he needed to handle it. Some people were saying, well, he needs to force his hand. Not really. It's like, look at the time. But that gets into my bigger point, which is, it's been almost 35 years since a young man put a question into the cultural lexicon. Can we all get along? And just this incident alone with Mitch McConnell answers the question in a negative way. No. I think a lot of us have tried to get along. My political career was during, within 10 years of that question. And I know that as fiercely as I fought for our people, especially in Mississippi, I did try to get along with people. I've gotten along with my opponents. I've gotten along with, my people on the other side of the political fence. I tried, and I didn't want to grow up to be this old bitter man, like I always refer to the Clint Eastwood's character in Gran Torino, right? But it's a trope that a lot of people have played in Hollywood. And heck, there was actually a movie called 12 Angry Men, right? So, I'm not I don't want to be that dude. I don't want to be that guy that, looks outside and tells folks get away from me and all that, get off my yard. I'm trying to be that guy. But the way the politics is going, and just the style, it's hard. It's hard to get along with people who are unreasonable in their thought. And I was just sitting thinking, they let that man go, the Olympian, they let him go because even Jeanine Pirro couldn't make up any evidence to convict that man of defacing the reflecting pool, right? Donald Trump's angry about that. So what? You were using her to cover up your mistake, which was hiring your pool guy to handle a project that monumental, and that you hate the President Obama so much that you didn't pay attention to the details, that you couldn't put paint on the surface that was put in there, right? You couldn't just put any old paint on there because it was designed not to do that. And they had to put that surface in such a way where you would still have the reflecting effect. You just wanted to give a friend of yours a hookup. And it was an embarrassing moment for you. And you asked Jeanine Pirro to sacrifice her reputation even more than it already is to find a scapegoat for your mistake. That's why we can't get along, right? When you have a group of people who have no sense of accountability, no sense of guilt even, who creates these illogical conspiracies and theories and thoughts and puts them out there as if they were facts and warp the minds of people who I thought were independent of thought, who were mature mentally. You create this environment of not being able to get along. You can't. Because sometimes you have to have contrition. Sometimes you have to realize, I probably shouldn't have said that the way that I did, right? And, and there's just some people you're not going to jive with. That's part of the human experience. But collectively as a society, we should get along. We should tolerate each other. But if your political strategy is to divide and conquer all the time, then you're creating an environment where we can't get along. Because if we got along, you wouldn't have a political foothold. And that's terrible. It's a terrible way to build an organization based off of chaos and confusion, right? And the crazy thing is they all profess to be Christian. And the Bible tells us that God is not a God of chaos and confusion. That domain belongs to the devil, Satan. That's his realm. But you say that you're a Christian, but the only way that you can maintain political power is to adopt an anti-Christian philosophy of chaos and confusion. That's crazy. And the scariest thing of all is that there are human beings out there who can't differentiate that. They can't see what I'm saying. President of the United States says, oh, this guy is a communist. Like he's the authority on communism. And there are people out there who say, oh, yeah, he got to be a communist because the president said so. What? No, he would be a communist if evidence said so, right? And there's this guy out here now who I've tried to get on the podcast who's really, really lighting up all these conservative shows, who's basically reminding people, look, y'all talking about socialism is bad. He literally did an interview from a man-made lake to prove his point. He said it was the government that built this lake that I'm riding this boat on. And y'all are saying that socialism is bad. Well, it was government workers that built this lake. It was the government that approved this lake to be built. It's government engineers that figured out how we could make this work. It wasn't private business. It was the government. So if you've got a problem with socialism, then I don't expect you to be on this lake. Right? So, he's doing his best going on these conservative shows, trying to educate these people. It's like, don't get caught up in that rhetoric, right? The Hoover Dam is socialism if you want to be ideologically pure. The WPA, that's all that was. We were trying to get America out of the Great Depression. And so the government created jobs, literally created jobs. Now we've gotten back to a point where we have some government jobs, and Elon Musk tried to take all of them away. But we have government jobs, but no, we expect you all in the private sector to handle, now that the depression's been over for almost 100 years, we kind of expected y'all to keep the ball rolling and create these jobs, keep the economy going. That's what y'all want. Even to the point where the government is deregulated too far. So, but every now and then, government has to step in and say, hey, look, we got to balance this thing out. We can't have all these people unemployed. The economy's at a standstill. We got to do stuff. World wars were big business for the government because it was like, okay, got to make tanks, got to make planes, got to make bombs, whatever. Right? But we're trying to stay out of world wars. So, but when we were doing that, that was socialism to a degree. So, but because people are not educated the way that they should be, either by choice or by deficiency in the system, we've created this culture where it's cool not to get along. And it's been simmering throughout time, but it's not what we're supposed to be about, right? I heard somebody say, and I think I may have mentioned it before, somebody said that the Confederates lost the Civil War, but they won the social war, right? And my position on that thought is I haven't surrendered yet. And there's millions of us who have not surrendered yet. So they ain't won. You can still fight them. They ain't won. They may have the upper hand, but they haven't won. And so I even challenge somebody to say, well, if you're saying that my position is the dawn of communism, then I can make the argument that your position is the continuation of the Confederacy. In the concept of American history, which one was worse? Because when we had to fight communism, we had to leave. We had to fight the Confederacy. It was in our own backyard. So which one is worse? Which one is more of a threat? The Confederacy or communism? And if we really want to be honest, it was the communists that lined up with the North in their sense of theory and thought to defeat the Confederacy in the Civil War. Now, granted, it hadn't been fully thought out and all that stuff, but you get what I'm saying. That concept of people caring for each other, caring for their fellow man, won the day in the Civil War, eventually. But ever since then, it's been a battle on the social front. So I just want to encourage people to focus in on whatever spiritual philosophy you buy into, that you believe in. Understand that especially in the Abrahamic religions, that tolerance is the key to everything. Tolerate those who have not achieved that spiritual awakening and you embrace the people who have, and you keep being an example so that those folks that have not received it will, right? That's why we have people going to synagogues and mosques and churches once a week. We're supposed to be getting encouragement for us to evangelize to others. We're supposed to be the examples. But if you're going to a church that says Jesus is Lord, and then when you step out of the church, you're doing the devil's work, that's not helping us get along. That's all I'm saying. Do some self-reflection. And on November the 3rd, 2026, once you have done your self-reflection, vote accordingly. All right, that's all I got. Thank y'all for listening. Till next time.
NBG Podcast Network.